Okay, so this is a video PowerPoint of our final genre of drama. So what is a play? Let's look at aspects of it. So drama is the second oldest literary form after poetry. Poetry is the oldest form. It was originally written and performed to be performed in the theater, so it was meant, in other words, to be acted and not read. But in the 19th century, that's when they started writing plays that were meant to be read. So a lot of our plays that we read, you have to keep in mind the fact that they actually weren't meant to be read, but it was more of a visual medium. So plays are active make-believe. It actually includes a lot of different people. You have your actors, you have your playwright, you have your stage text, and then you have the audience as part of it as well. So the Greek theater, so we're going to start with this kind of category, and in the Greek theater, they had these amphitheaters, as you can see here. This is an example of an amphitheater. And you can still go and look at some of these that have survived. And you could really, the acoustics were amazing for something that was obviously pre-technology and all of that, as we consider technology with any kind of electronics or something. But anyone who was in the center here performing, an audience all the way up here, as this man is, could hear absolutely everything that was said just due to the massive acoustics that were involved. Okay. Next, we would look at the timeline for Greek theater. So Greek theater started because of Dionysus. It was in celebration of the god Dionysus, which is a god of revelry, of wine, of laughter, of fun, and of plays. And so what notably is interesting about Dionysus, as I say here, a social leveler, is that it didn't matter if you were rich or poor. Oftentimes those were interchangeable with regards to Dionysus. So it wasn't until the 6th century BCE that Thespis brought spoken dialogue. So before that, it was more about choruses and songs and dances. But we finally get spoken dialogue in the 6th century, and 525 to 456 BCE. Aeschylus, he brought tragedy, and also brought a second actor, which then led to help dramatize the stories. And then 496 to 406 BCE, we have Sophocles, who brought a third actor. So as I said, elements of Greek theater were dances, songs, the chorus. So the chorus was meant to be like symbolic of society as a whole, and was supposed to be how they felt. It was often done, it was done during the day because that's when they had lighting. It was done outside in an amphitheater, as I showed you. And as I said, it's more about listening and watching, but more so about listening to what's going on. So Aristotle's Unities, philosophers of the time were fearful of the power of drama, and so what they would do is they wanted to make it more realistic, okay, because they feared that what would have been seen on the stage might then be enacted live. That was their biggest fear. Or it might like corrupt people's morals or something like that, because people couldn't distinguish between fiction and reality at that time period. So he believed that in the Unities that it's strictly adhered to with regards to time. So in other words, when you read the play, the plot line of the play, so not how long it takes you to read it, but the plot line of the play takes less than 1 hour. In other words, if you start the play, the setting of the play starts at like 9 a.m., then the play is supposed to finish, the setting is supposed to finish by 10. So which coincides with probably how long a person would physically be there to watch the play, which is probably an hour, hence the realism. The second aspect would be space. In other words, it should be only one setting, because as the audience is only in one setting, you shouldn't be able to move settings. So they wouldn't have plays that were like set in England and then France or something like that Shakespeare always does, right? He moves around like from country to country, from one act to the next. Well, the Greek theater didn't do that. It was all in one setting for the most part. Okay, then we shift into the Elizabethan theater or the Shakespearean theater, most notably the Globe Theater. It's a wonderful experience. If you ever get a chance to go there, I highly suggest that you watch a play at the Globe Theater, although there's also the Swan Theater and there's some others that are quite good there too, but the Globe is renowned for having been Shakespeare's home, as it were, and even though what they have now is a rebuild because it burnt down. But anyway, so you can see some of the constraints, some of the issues with regards to putting on a play in the Globe Theater. Obviously, as you see here, the sky, so it's open air, and so a lot of it would have been, again, daytime. Although they were starting to bring in other modes of lighting, they were starting to bring in like candles and things, but obviously, as I just said, it often led to theaters burning down because a costume might catch on fire and then catch the scenery and etc. So it was actually pretty dangerous to have the flames. Also, some other constraints would be the ideas that if somebody is walking in on the stage here, then you have these giant pillars holding up the proscenio, and so the giant pillars can block somebody's view of the actors performing, and so actors had to continually move around, and they couldn't just stay in one spot because then they would have been blocked. You'll also notice that there is a balcony, so notably the Romeo and Juliet balcony scene and things like that. But in addition to using it as setting for plays, the orchestra was up there. So rather than what we're mainly used to, which is the orchestra being down below in what's called the orchestra pit, actually the orchestra would have been up here in the balcony playing the music. You'll also notice that there are multiple exits and entrances. So there are two doors on either side, and then there's a main larger opening in the center here. So again, with Romeo and Juliet, you notably have through a good majority of the play, the Capulets would go in and out of one door and the Montagues in and out of the other door. And then it says at the end that they both left through the same door, which is this one here probably. So it's the idea of using the setting to reinforce themes. And they did that quite often. Another aspect of using the setting to reinforce themes is there would have been also a trap door at the bottom here. And that trap door would have been for people who were going to the devil or people who have died. So it's kind of supposed to be symbolic of the descent and death. So that was one way as well to get people off stage in an easier fashion, other than having to enter and exit through those main doors there. You'll notice that this looks like the heavens. So if that is supposed to be hell and the trap door, then you have the painted heavens and stars on the underside of the projecting Eve here. Lastly would be about the audience and what you notice. So you have tiers here, balcony seating, and this is where the people who had money would be. And then you have a bunch of people who are actually, this gives you better perspective, who are actually at stage level. And these are what would have been called the groundlings. So groundlings were pretty much equivalent to a peasant, somebody who didn't have a lot of money, or even a slave, depending if their master was there. They would get to see the play, but you have to stand the whole time. There are absolutely no seats in the groundlings area. So that's interesting that you're standing the whole time. And not only that, but you have to look up because this is the literal height of the stage, probably comes up to your shoulders. So you're watching a play looking up at the actors, and that's a different and unique perspective as well. Okay, so the timeline for the Elizabethan or Shakespearean theater would be 1558 to 1603, and that's when the first Queen Elizabeth of England was reigning. People who were associated with the theater were not exactly the most reputable people. They were seen as disreputable, not criminals, but certainly not proper society, as it were. It was all male actors. You probably all know that. So it was all male actors. So all of the female roles were played by young males who hadn't quite reached puberty and thus could get a higher range on their voice, right? Their tone would be much higher. And then I already told you about the groundlings. So the theater of Shakespeare, it's a playwright had to please everybody. It was very unique in the fact that you had upper class, and then, as I said, all the way down to like peasants and slaves and things like that. So how do you deal with such a range of A, education, and B, manners, and what would entertain such a broad and diverse audience? So oftentimes in Shakespearean plays, you'll notice that there are like high wit, there are difficult jokes, as it were, and lots of romanticism and metaphors, highly metaphoric scenes. But then you'll also get like the Joker slapstick, people just running around smacking each other and things like that. So you get both in one play. And he had to do that, and others of his time. So the company might offer as many as 30 plays in a season, and that's a lot to remember, right? You have to memorize all those lines. And so how do you do that? How do you help your actors memorize those lines and keep them in their heads? Well, you utilize what's called blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter, and now you all know what that means. So you'll notice that plays during this time period utilized unrhymed iambic pentameter, and oftentimes at the end of scenes would end in a couplet, in a rhyming couplet, and that acted as a cue to the actor. Okay, the next aspect would be 19th century theater. So in the 19th century theater, you'll notice as I have these pictures here, we're now brought inside. So it's no longer an outdoor activity. You've got the balcony seating, you've got the heavy draperies and things like that. We see more shift to electric for lighting. They were using electricity for lighting, and that helped because now they didn't have to fear that anything would catch on fire. It became an indoor activity. You'll also notice that the stage is different, right? So now we have a cutoff on the stage. So no longer do you have the audience encircling the stage from either side, but now you have it like a straight line, a divide between the audience and the actors. The sets are far more elaborate because they could. The audience, again, is divided by this economic status. You have the upper class and the higher tiers up top. And the audience had to be quiet. This was very unique because prior to that time period in Greek and in Shakespearean theater, the audience would shout. They would shout things out at the actors. They would laugh loudly. They would make jokes. They would be talking about something else. They weren't maybe not even listening. So it was quite different than what happened in the 19th century and more modern plays, where now we have to all sit quietly and just take it all in rather than being an active participant. So then the theater genres. So there are many genres in theater, but it started out, and what are the major categories would be tragedy and comedy. So with tragedy, I want to start there. So with tragedy, you have a typical tragic plot line. And it's not to say that they didn't have others, but this was the kind of the common plot line for any tragedy. You're going to start with your protagonist who is doing well, who's prosperous, has money, who's happy, whatever. And I say he because it usually was he, but it didn't have to be. And then all of a sudden, some sort of higher force creates a lot of conflict for this protagonist, and you have this reversal of fortune, and you have a fall, right? Your protagonist falls somehow. Mainly it's because of a quote-unquote tragic flaw in this protagonist, maybe quote-unquote hero figure. And that tragic flaw can be anything. Oftentimes it was a moral failing, like maybe they were too prideful. That's a very common tragic flaw in our hero figures, is that their pride, their ego is too extreme. And then this flaw leads them to poverty. So they fall so far that it's all the way into poverty or misery. And by the end, though, even though they've fallen, there's this sense of like recognition, this sense of self-understanding. They've learned at the end. That's the last part of that plot line. So there are unique style and objectives to a tragedy. You want to look at the fact that most tragedies are written in what's called elevated style, which is, again, the more upper class, more educated syntax and diction, and it's going to use a lot of figures of speech, and you have to unpack these concepts. It is about the tragic way of life, so just about the fact